Hello to folks who are joining us today. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let people come on into this room, and we'll get started in about 2 minutes. So get comfy, grab something to drink, maybe something to eat, and hold on for 2 minutes. For those who have just joined, we're waiting 1 more minute to allow other people to file on in. So get comfy and excited for a great hour and a half. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. We are so excited that you have all joined us today for the first of our Speakers Series events. Before we begin, we're just going to take a moment to outline a few practical matters. At the bottom of your screen are 2 functions I want to bring to your attention. We have a Q&A option and we have a closed captioning option. First, the Q&A is where you can drop any questions that you would like to ask our speakers for the Q&A portion at the end. And you can drop those questions in whenever you want over the next hour. Second, we have the closed captioning available for the series, and you can enable that through selecting that closed captioning CC button right at the bottom of your screen. We also, as you see, have 2 fantastic ASL interpreters here with us today. As we begin this session, I want to begin by acknowledging that the University of Waterloo is on the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract. That's land granted to the 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. While acknowledging territory allows us to recognize the enduring presence and actions of Indigenous communities, peoples, and lands, more work still has to follow. Chelsea Vowell, a Métis writer and educator, has written that when it comes to territorial acknowledgements, just saying the names of surrounding nations does not automatically mean understanding. Because of this, Vowell suggests that best practices for truly recognizing land need to not only emerge, but evolve over time through deeper engagement with the histories, the understandings, and the impacts of land acknowledgements. Vowell's really clear when she says that moving beyond territorial acknowledgements means asking hard questions about what needs to be done once we are aware of Indigenous presence. It requires that settlers remain uncomfortable, and it means making concrete disruptive change. As if in response, 2 days ago, Cherokee scholar Joseph Pierce tweeted a set of questions that can be applied here as we are working to evolve our practices. Pierce asked, What would it mean to consider relations, indigenous forms of reciprocity, care, and knowledge, as central to the teaching of theory? What would it mean, in other words, to relate across worlds as a method of political praxis that centers relational constellations? These really beautiful and thoughtful questions and the call to better understand connections and histories highlight two key themes of our speaker series. And those themes are a deep commitment to relationality and a deep commitment to affecting change through agitation, through resistance, and through support and community building. Today and in the next two events, we're bringing an overarching commitment to drawing together a range of experiences and standpoints that reflect these themes, as well as the long-standing mantra of the personal is political within the digital moment. Now, to give a little bit of context, this speaker series is a result of our recently published edited collection, Networked Feminisms, Activist Assemblies and Digital Practices. And this book comes out of our collaborative work at the Feminist Think Tank, situated at the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo. Feminist Think Tank, or FTT, is focused on research creation, and our primary focus is on facilitating practices, preservation, and public-facing dialogues on digital activism. As co-directors of FTT and co-editors of Networked Feminisms, alongside the wonderful Michelle MacArthur and Milena Radzikowska, Shanna and I are so thrilled to finally share this book with the world. We are really excited that this speaker series has come together, especially during this particular moment of the pandemic. And we are so deeply grateful to our speakers for generously sharing their time and their work with us. And we're so happy that you as audience members are also here with us. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the Games Institute, and the Anti-Racism, Decolonization, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee at the GI. So the Games Institute is an interdisciplinary research institute that supports academic endeavors in interactive media, interaction science, and in immersive media. We also want to give a very special shout out to our amazing co-op students, Vivaraka and Eliana, who did such great work helping us to organize. Okay, so now for today's content. Today, we're going to hear some brief talks from our three invited speakers who are also contributors to the book. We have Tara Conley, Melissa Brown, and Helena Suárez Val, and we're thinking about how to better understand networked feminist activism. We're thinking about its uses, its histories, and its necessities. After their presentations, we'll have a moderated discussion with our panelists, moderated by Shannon McDonald, and then we will have audience Q&A portion. And so just as a reminder, feel free to drop your questions into that Q&A chat whenever. And now I have the honor of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Tara Conley. Tara Conley is an interdisciplinary Black feminist scholar, media maker, and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. Her research centers Black life in the study and exploration of place, media histories, and technoculture. You can learn more about Dr. Conley's scholarship and multimedia projects by visiting www.taralconley.org, and that link will be dropped into the chat for you all.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're from. I hope everyone can see my screen okay. I am working from Canva, my new favorite platform. So first, I want to thank the organizers and the editors of this event and book, respectively. I know for sure it's been quite a labor of love for everyone involved, and it's certainly a privilege to be included in this volume of work with these other amazing thinkers and writers. As we mentioned, my name is Tara L. Conley, and I'm assistant professor at the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University in New Jersey. I'm also a race and technology practitioner fellow at Stanford University. So today I'll kind of be talking briefly about my research, which is reflected in the opening chapter of the volume entitled A Sign of the Times, #Feminism as a Conceptual Framework. And I'd like to use this as an opportunity, really, to provide an overview, again, of the chapter and give you a sense of how I arrived at this notion of #feminism as a conceptual framework. Just as an aside, I've always been curious about how we make meaning with objects in ways that also articulate how we know, how we are, how we make, and how we tell stories about ourselves and our world. And these objects can be physical objects, and in the case of hashtags, these sort of digital objects, digital artifacts. So when you read through the chapter, the reader will certainly find that I draw a great deal from thinker Sylvia Wynter, who has for years now helped me kind of understand the relationship between ontology, epistemology, ideology, and technologies. And if anyone's ever read Sylvia Wynter's work before, it's akin to kind of being lost and at the same time not wanting to be found. Her work is thick. It's difficult, and I don't want to escape it ever. And I'm also grateful for Catherine McKittrick, who kind of helps translate her work in her own work as I read through it. All right, so with that being said, and just to provide you an overview of the chapter, I sort of start off with a brief overview of hashtag studies and a cultural history of hashtag feminism. I talk a little bit about some of the methodologies and theories that I incorporate in the chapter. And then I introduce how I conceptualize hashtag feminism, namely, as I discuss it as hashtag feminism as discourse, hashtag feminism as embodied practice, hashtag feminism as ideology. Okay, and here I draw also from Andre Brock and his foundational methodological work, Critical Technocultural Discourse Analysis. Brock is also another one whose work I enjoy kind of getting lost in as well. At the end of the chapter, I offer a vision for feminism in the networked and information era from a Black feminist perspective. And I'll conclude my presentation here by reading an excerpt from the ending of that chapter, okay? So how in the world did I get here? Well, the story of my research begins with Renisha McBride. In 2014, I published a commentary piece for the special issue of Feminist Media Studies on hashtag activism titled hashtag Renisha McBride to hashtag Remember Renisha, Locating Our Stories and Finding Justice. It was around this time when I was also developing the website hashtag feminism. It was a WordPress website that I sort of coded, and it was a way to document feminist discourse across Twitter. And I was working with a bunch of wonderful writers and editors at the time who I also mentioned in the chapter. I had been fascinated by the work of Black women online in bringing about awareness and collective action, particularly as it concerned Black women and violence. So for those who don't know, in 2013, 19-year-old Renisha McBride was shot and killed by a white vigilante resident in Dearborn Heights, Michigan. I followed this story in order to map out the impact of online organizing around the hashtag Remember Renisha. This hashtag influenced offline protests and brought media attention that ultimately led to the conviction of McBride's killer. So when I talk about hashtag feminism today, I'm talking about something that is more than just a sort of moniker, right, of 21st century feminism. As a result of looking closely at these online organizing and storytelling practices over the years, I came to an understanding about, again, this relationship between discourse and practices and the technologies that carry them across time and space. And so this chapter kind of reflects that, mulling over many years now, I guess, on this relationship. And it is a culmination of my work that describes hashtag feminism as a conceptual framework. So in this iteration, again, I mentioned that I break down hashtag feminism according to three constructs, as discourse, as embodied practice, and as ideology. So in fleshing out an understanding of hashtag feminism as discourse, I analyze in the chapter a corpus of digital feminist scholarship, along with the website that I founded in 2013, hashtag feminism. I analyze blog posts and infographics from 2014 to 2017. Second, I analyze hashtag feminism as an embodied practice by examining the feminist storytelling and organizing project of hashtag #MeToo. And I examine these practices through Sylvia Wynter's concept of homoneurons, or the storytelling species. Wynter's notes that, quote, The human is not only a languaging being, but also a storytelling species, a bios mythoi. Okay. Lastly, I conceptualize hashtag feminism as ideology. It's sort of a set of beliefs and values among these competing solidarities across contested feminist landscapes. Okay. So again, in thinking about a cultural history of hashtag feminism, I kind of go back to the year 2013. This was the year, in my opinion, and probably other opinions, that Black women and women of color, the media makers, the activists, the storytellers, we all trended, right? In other words, it was like this watershed moment for feminist discourse and practice. It was an origin story of sorts, a moment of authoring for us. And I can't not talk about 2013 without also talking about its cultural significance. This was also the year that Beyonce dropped her digital album, which was also a historical moment in culture and music. So we had Beyonce's digital album, we had these sort of intra-community tensions, the political climate, and the expansion of technology infrastructures. I believe Twitter around that time went public. And all these things were shaping how feminist discourse and practices played out across these online spaces. And so I do consider 2013 to be this year of when digital media landscapes changed. And these sort of newer modes of sociality like feminist hashtags emerged, and Black women and women of color were shaping this frontier. So in taking that into consideration, I arrive at this vision of feminism in this moment. And again, I like to read an excerpt from the ending of the chapter that describes this vision. Hashtag feminism as a conceptual framework captures technical processes that locate discursive forms of feminism, feminist practices like storytelling and organizing, an ideological underpinning of feminism, as well as locates technical infrastructures that align or malign with feminist ethos for justice and liberation. The constructs analyzed here manifest in various ways that are informed by ontological renderings of humanness. Hashtags locate these manifestations, namely the tensions that exist across feminist ways of knowing, the episteme, feminist ways of doing and making, the techne, and ways of being, the ontological. These constructs, however, ought not be understood in isolation, but rather considered for their mutually constitutive function for locating sites of becoming. When I wrote Decoding Black Feminist Hashtags as Becoming in 2017, I was demonstrating decoding as stance, a critical method for mapping entanglement amongst feminist discourse practices and ideologies of technology. I was also offering this method as a vision for how hashtags locate where and how shared anger can contribute to renewed solidarities. Becoming is understood as a threshold of potentiality, where freedom from forms of oppression can take shape. Expanding on that vision here, I consider that in order to locate sites of becoming across ways of knowing and across ways of being, we must reorient and respatialize ourselves to see where, quote, ontological unity can exist. Technical processes, while imperfect, can help us reorient ourselves to feminist histories across time and space, namely when and where feminists got it right and when and where we got it wrong. If a vision of feminism is one of freedom from all forms of oppression, then it must also consider a future that does not rely solely on contained scripts of humanists for justice and liberation. It is not enough to advocate for representation, as evident in some of the hashtags outlined here as Me Too. A feminist vision of freedom must also consider ways of knowing and doing that can upend systems of oppression that seek to contain and reorganize people as a result of colonization. Locating contested solidarities can be an entry point for transformation. For instance, hashtag UOCases was a necessary response to hashtag Stop Street Harassment, as hashtag Solidarity is for White Women was a necessary response to hashtag FemFuture. These hashtags, among others created by Black women, locate both righteous anger and love for our communities. They find stories of shared resistance and solidarity. They also provide an opportunity to re-envision freedom as a shared sense of advocacy, one that in practice manifests as disrupting fixed systems of thought and process and disrupting a one-size-fits-all way of doing feminism. And that will conclude my section. I've located here a bibliography that I cite a whole bunch of wonderful resources. So you're more than welcome to visit that bibliography. Thank you so much for listening.
Tara, thank you so much for bringing us through your chapter and for offering us #feminism as discourse, as embodied practice, and as ideology. My students recently read this chapter, like we were saying before, they loved it, just as they loved Melissa Brown's chapter as well. And now we have Melissa Brown, who's going to talk to us about her work. Melissa Brown is a scholar of Black feminist thought, digital sociology, social movements, and sexual politics. She has a forthcoming chapter titled For Black Feminist Digital Sociology in the forthcoming edited volume, Black Feminist Sociology, published by Routledge, and for which she serves as the digital editor of the companion website. Prior to arriving at SCU, Melissa was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. Previously, she has published her research on anti-racist and Black feminist social media activism in the journals Ethnic and Racial Studies and Sociology Compass. She currently maintains blackfeminisms.com as a public scholarly project that disseminates academic research and theory by and about Black women across the African diaspora. And that link will be in the chat for folks to check out.
Thank you for that introduction, Bree. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. So this presentation was originally designed for a longer talk, so unfortunately I will not be able to go through it in its entirety today. But my chapter, Virtual Sojourners, was originally about trying to talk about Black feminist activism and culture. And as I was editing the chapter, kind of one of the two things that stuck out to me, particularly for Black women and LGBTQ people who use digital technology, there were ways that navigating virtual space and virtual technology facilitated for them both a duality of visibility and erasure, and that's kind of what I'll cover today. So I have pictured here Darnella Frazier, who we all became familiar with in 2020 when her video of the death of George Floyd went viral after she shared it on social media. And as we all know, that was kind of, I would say maybe the third iteration of the waves of Black Lives Matter we're familiar with in terms of a movement. If we start with Trayvon Martin, then Mike Brown, and then we can say George Floyd kind of being these moments where the public became aware of these movements and mobilized off social media into the streets. And so in thinking about Darnella in particular, I think she represents kind of the concept that I'm trying to get at with the virtual sojourner is the ways that people who are marginalized in our society are not only marginalized by the state, but also by the new information and communication technologies that we're documenting. So for example, Darnella talked about how she was harassed for uploading the video that revealed the identity of George Floyd's killer. But simultaneously, her use of this technology opens up avenues for liberation and freedom for Black people. And I want to talk about that further throughout the talk. So I built the virtual sojourner concept off of Patricia Hill Collins' concept, The Outsiders Within, and she talked about it from a sociological standpoint, but this concept lets us think about the ways that within particularly the academy, Black women intellectuals, other marginalized intellectuals occupies the space where we have a type of knowledge that is constructed both by being marginalized on the outside, but also being invited within spaces, particularly post-integration, post-civil rights, and thinking about the ways that gives us this particular vantage point on society. So in the context of digital media, I was thinking about the ways that the outsider within, when they leverage digital tools and create digital practices, they're able not only to innovate visibility for Black people within our contemporary society, but also able to address the ways that these same technologies can be used to marginalize or harm. And the three types of harm that I focus on in the chapter are co-optation, erasure, and appropriation. So in thinking about the digital spaces and practices of virtual sojourners, I build off the work of scholars who touch on this idea that Black women and LGBTQ people have created spaces online that function as counterpublics and enclaves where they're able to self-author and self-define, as well as self-determine their own sense of culture and activism. And furthermore, thinking about the ways they take on certain types of digital practices at the margins of being in the virtual sphere that enable them to create and generate unique perspectives, particularly in the realm of activism. So the frameworks that I build on for this chapter were, first I built on with Black digital studies. So like Tara mentioned, I interfaced with the work of Andre Brock, scholars like Catherine Knight Steele, Kira Gaunt, and thinking about the ways that one of the, I guess, key tenets of Black digital studies is pushing it back against the deficit framework of digital divide rhetoric, and instead I guess, theorizing around Black people, Black LGBTQ people and women and Black men as agents of digital technology and digital innovation, and thinking about an asset framework applying to that. However, another thing that this technology brings up, of course, is this idea that the very same technologies that do create and empower opportunities for Black people are also being used against them. And there's various ways that we can look at that lens. And as I mentioned, I look at it through co-optation, erasure, and appropriation. And so as Bree mentioned earlier in my introduction, the way that I look at this is by bringing together Black feminist thought as well as the field of digital sociology. And so in my own work, that typically looking at digital activism, so research on hashtag movements such as hashtag Save Her Name, as well as Black Lives Matter, particularly post-Ferguson. So the context of this chapter was I looked at various hashtag cases and also various other uses of digital media between 2015 and 2020. And I was really interested in the ways that Black people were using these technologies to document their lived experiences, and how by doing that, they can challenge assumptions about race and gender and sexuality, not only in the 21st century, but even dating back to colonial era, depending on the types of work that they're doing with digital technology. And then, of course, by doing so, they engage in types of activism that address the violence that are specific to Black women and LGBTQ people. So one of the ways that I did that was looking at intersectionality in social media activism. So thinking about, for example, the South African student movements and how those movements built intersectionality into their work as critical praxis, thinking about how to organize and mobilize and maintain solidarity, but also then bringing in virtual technology to disseminate this intersectional consciousness, and with the aim of creating what some scholars call a digital diaspora. So thinking about in particular how these student movements kind of motivated other student movements that happened across Africa at that time, and using digital technology as a means to create those navigations. So one of these movements was hashtag Rhodes Must Fall, which began in 2015 at the University of Cape Town. And their aim and motivation, kind of like a similar movements here in the United States, was to get a statue of a colonizer named Cecil Roe James removed from the student campus. And then, of course, they had an affiliated movement, hashtag Fees Must Fall. I won't play this video at the moment, but Fees Must Fall was a broader umbrella movement that other South African students ended up participating in. And this movement in particular was led by Black queer women. And part of their motivation in their work by using intersectionality was to, one, challenge the legacy of androcentric and cisnormative perspectives on Black liberation, particularly this belief that liberation comes in the figure or embodiment of a Black cishet male. So that's kind of one example that I'll show as far as my social media activism piece of the chapter. Others that I cover are Say Her Name and gender-based violence in the Caribbean. Another topic that I touch on in the chapter is this idea of Black LGBTQ people shaping culture through digital technology use. And by doing so, they both queer Blackness and racialized sexuality. So here I have pictured 3 podcast hosts by the name of Marsha's Plate, and their particular podcast kind of represents the ways that Black LGBTQ digital technology users are creating content that not only upends what Black people know about queer identity, but also what LGBTQ people know about Black identity. And not only do they do this in the virtual space, but by creating this virtual content and thinking about the ways that podcasts in particular function as like a contemporary iteration of radio media, they're able to cross-platform and directly challenge the ways that Black LGBTQ people are represented on broader platforms. So the video that I have pictured here, they went to a local news radio in Houston, news radio show in Houston to address the ways that popular rapper named Boosie at the time was disparaging Dwayne Wade's daughter, Zaya Wade, for her trans identity. So once again, digital technology kind of created and facilitated this space for them to be reach a larger and broader audience than historically they were able to do so. So in general, I think my argument about that is thinking about the ways that when Black LGBTQ people adopt digital technology, they bring their cultural practices into that space through digital practice. And then of course, by creating certain types of queer virtual spaces that center Blackness, they're able to articulate perspectives, bringing, as Bell Hooks said, something from the margins to the center about who they are and what it means to be Black and LGBTQ in today's society. And so skipping to the end really quick. Finally, thinking about the chapter touches on how there's pitfalls of being digital technology users as virtual sojourners. So in the case of going back to hashtag activism, the Caribbean gender-based violence that I talked about, the woman pictured here was incarcerated temporarily in Jamaica for a law that they had sanctioning the use of digital technology to do certain things. So for example, her movement was about confronting a pastor for sexually assaulting the girl children in his congregation. She shared some type of information related to him, and the state ended up penalizing her for it. And as a matter of fact, I feel like the entire law was actually constructed around responding to these particular hashtag movements in particular. So once again, thinking about the ways these digital technologies are being used to surveil and penalize Black people in a way that Simone Brown calls racializing surveillance. And of course, as I said, there's appropriation and co-optation, and you can read about that further in the chapter. So in conclusion, I think the key takeaways that I want us to think about is, of course, thinking about Black digital technology users as innovative and not relying on that deficit framework of digital technology use, and also thinking about how general digital media practices take on new meaning when Black women and LGBTQ people take them up. And ultimately, as I said, reflecting on this as a project of Black feminist digital sociology, using Black feminist thought to intervene into digital sociology by bringing in the outsider within standpoint, and then of course, using that perspective then to theorize about contemporary digital sociology. And that is it, I believe, so thank you.
Melissa, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for talking to us about your concept of the virtual sojourner and how Black and women and Black, queer, and trans folks really play a key role as the virtual sojourner. My digital feminist futures class read your chapter last week, and we loved the way that you talk about how the virtual sojourner appropriates the digital technologies that erase Black folks to become innovative, to find visibility. And so they loved reading through those ideas. My students also found Helena's work incredibly compelling. And when we were signing up for reading presentations, I had to remind them that there was one reading from Helena and 15 of them that wanted to use it for the workshop. So I had to be the bearer of bad news there. But good news for all my students who showed up and good news for all of you, Helena is now going to share with us. So Helena Suárez Val is a researcher activist focused on feminism and data practices. She is a PhD candidate at the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at University of Warwick. With Catherine D'Ignazio and Silvana Fumega, she co-leads Data Against Feminicide, an action research project. Since 2015, she has been recording feminicides in Uruguay at feministidouruguay.net, a database and map of gender-related deaths of women in Uruguay. And that link is in the chat for y'all to check out as well.
Wow, no pressure. Thank you so much for having me at this meeting, but also thank you so much to the editors of the book. I think it's mind-blowing to see the work that has been going on and also how long it's taken to get there. It's a testament to your perseverance through pandemics and loads of challenges. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my work. I'm not exactly presenting the chapter, but hopefully it will make sense to you all. I'm working on feminicide data. This is what I'm saying I do now. But I started thinking about all of this feminicide data as an activist in about 2013 also. I think that year definitely had something going. I came back to Uruguay after living for a long, long time in the UK and got very involved with the feminist movement here. I'm in Uruguay right now, so I'm speaking from the south, literally. So I got involved with the feminist movement, and at the time there was a very strong debate going on at the heart of the feminist movement about these two slightly different terms, femicide and feminicide, femicidio y feminicidio, which had slightly different theoretical contents and activist contents. And the feminist movement was quite divided. There was a lot of arguments, but around that time, there was a release, and the feminist movement in Latin America, by and large, decided that we could use the terms interchangeably to empower the term for activism against violence against women, and to let behind the kind of more theoretical discussions while keeping those tensions alive to continue to enrich the content of the term. And what the term refers to is to gender-related homicides or other violent deaths of women. So that includes the kind of murders that you will identify, for example, intimate partner murders or other misogynist murders of women. But it also involves thinking around other violent deaths, for example, deaths of women through illegal abortions because of the state failing to provide for the right to women to choose. Or it might include, in regions where these practices are more common, deaths related to honor killings, or related, again, in other regions to for example, female genital mutilation practices. So so in any case where there's a violent death, the term femicide or feminicide gives us this sense that we should use a gender perspective to analyze what happened there and the structural context in which this killing or this violent death took place. Not forgetting the intersectional perspective, because gender doesn't work on its own, but we know that it interacts in multiple domains, as we know from Patricia Collins' Matrix of Domination, different sites and scales of oppression that interact between each other. And so this is, as you know, the work of Black feminists scholars. So I'm here in Uruguay. I'm involved in the movement, feminist movement. We're working against feminicide. And what happens is I started getting involved with producing data about feminicide in Uruguay. At the time, there was no official data. Even now, there is very difficult to access official data on feminicide. And what I noticed as well is that I wasn't alone. There were several other actors making feminicide data and data visualizations. And there seemed to be a proliferation of these data artifacts. As again, we know we're living in an era of datification, if you know this term. So this idea that our personal lives are being datified through self-surveillance, for example, in our phones and digital artifacts, but also through our use of social media. But activists are also creating our own data artifacts. So we're turning the tables and using essentially tools and techniques that may seem to be of surveillance to call the states and to evidence the lack of official data on issues that are important to groups that are marginalized, such as women and others. So my practice started with this case, Shamila Rodriguez. So her murder appeared in the news after several days of being searched for by her family. But the media had been very strongly focusing on her as the wrong kind of victim. The question was whether she studied, whether she didn't study, if she took drugs, what kind of friends she did, whether she went out, all the things that we're familiar with in terms of a sexist approach and sexist characterization of women by the media. When her body was found, I and several other women were present at a feminist assembly in Montevideo, Uruguay's capital, and we went out en masse to the streets to protest against her murder, to protest against the lack of government action, and also to protest about the sexist treatment in the media of her case. That year, which was 2014, there were several cases, and the next year more, and the next year more, and the next year more. As a way to keep track of our activism, and also as a way to keep memory of the women that we were protesting for and with, we started this collective that I was part of, the Coordinadora de Feminismos del Uruguay, the feminist coordination in Uruguay. We started a spreadsheet, and at one point I made the spreadsheet into a map. My intention at the time was to locate myself and to locate potential viewers on the land. I thought there was something very strong about this positioning of myself and others in the map. I remember thinking about when I see this map on my phone and there is blue dots alongside on all the red dots, and that blue dot is myself, and how you could see yourself surrounded by feminicide, and how in a way that might make viewers reflect on their positioning vis-a-vis feminicide. So the maps that I present in the chapter that I've been talking, you will read, are very intimately connected to protest. So as I said, we would go out in protest after a case, and we would place an entry in a database and eventually a dot on the map. This picture here shows one of those protests, in fact, a very prominent protest that happened in June 2015, which is connected to the Ni Una Menos movement. So Ni Una Menos, which means not one more woman, or not one woman less, is a movement that started from Argentina, but that has a long genealogy of protests in the feminist movement since the 60s, since the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s, and beyond. In fact, some of you might know that the International Day for the Eradication of Violence Against Women was a date proposed to the UN, campaigned for to the UN by the Latin American feminist movement in recognition of the murder of 3 Dominican Republic women political activists. So this photograph shows us the protests that happened in Uruguay. Ni Una Menos protests spread around the continent. And in this one, the banner reads, "If they touch one, they touch all of us." And this phrase made me reflect a lot on this idea of quantification. And again, you'll read that in the chapter, where I think about what it means to count, what it means to count one, and then to extend that count to all of us. So these are the themes that I was exploring in the chapter: the idea of mapping, the idea of political activism, the idea of an effective political atmosphere, this electricity that runs through the movement, but also through the region, that could be contagious, some scholars might say. So in the chapter, I just wanted to kind of throw some of the key concepts, and I can share this with you, but also you'll see all of this in the chapter. So these are the kind of frameworks that I've been mixing, and I really like to mix frameworks and to see what's productive in the mix, and try not to resolve the tensions between competing, perhaps, scholarships, but to see what I can, how I can make them connect and play with each other so that they work to understand the problem that I'm looking at. And so in this particular work, I've used affect and emotion theories, theories of feminist emotions, affective atmospheres, and affective politics frameworks, which are all coming from affect theories as well. But also some technical scholarship. So you will see that I talk about atmospheric correction, and that is a term that actually relates to satellite imagery, but which in the chapter I used to think through how feminist activists try to use technology to affect the affective atmosphere, or to correct the affective atmosphere around feminicide from indifference to action. And a related term, affective amplification, which is the name that I chose for describing these mappings, comes from actually from an analysis of video games by James Ash. Other important terms and concepts that have helped in my work are the concept of reverberation, which Adi Kunzman has used to understand the circulation and movement of violence online, and the ideas of public grief that Judith Butler has discussed at length. And obviously, there's a lot of thinking around the feminist critiques of quantitative and appropriation of quantitative methodologies. I'm just going to quickly show this, because if you've seen the chapter, you see that the picture is upside down, which is how I wanted it to be. But in the chapter is the right way round, which is fine. But I like to, I'm putting this out there because one thing that really helps me in my work is to make my data strange. So one of the methods I use is to play with the objects and the texts, or the interviews I'm reading. And for example, in this case, I turned over the map that I was looking at, and it suggested the idea of public tears, which again, you will see in the chapter, which may sound perhaps a bit simple, but I think I don't like to escape these notions that may sound a bit sugary, because I'm interested in affective and emotional content of the work that I've been investigating. And some of it is maybe sounds a bit dramatic. So I want to finish by telling you a little bit of what I'm working on next, because I'm now going on to study more about feminicide data. And so I'm bringing all this theoretical content and adding new thinkers and theories and practices to look at mapping the space of circulation into data. So I'm having looked at, with my interviews with other practitioners, at the affective practices, at the production of data. I now want to look at how that data circulates on social media. And I think in my, when I finish my PhD, there'll be definitely a lot more linkages with the work of Melissa and Tara, because I'm now looking at how feminicide data travels, with which affects and with which actions. it circulates in social media, in particular on Twitter. And finally, I didn't want to end without saying that I'm also collaborating with Catherine D'Ignazio and Silvana Fumega on this project called Data Against Feminicide, through which we're collaboratively working with other practitioners to design tools that support the work of activists already doing this work. And there are many of us in the Americas, but also in the rest of the world. And I invite you all to take a look at that work as well, on the website dataagainstfeminicide.net, because there's a lot of kind of different aspects to thinking about data on social media. I think it's a really rich object of analysis, and I hope you'll be interested to follow up a little bit more on that after reading the chapter, and you can get in touch anytime with me. Thank you.
Helena, thank you so much for sharing your activist practices and for your work here with us about the Feminist Coordination of Uruguay to bring us really back to the land and self-positioning and collective action. I think those are three really key themes that are important to bring together, and the way your chapter does that is really beautiful and important. The map is this really powerful, affective, and political reminder, like you say, of the need to reflect and act against feminicide. And there's so much to unpack here, especially as you begin talking about data and the datafication of the self, which is so fascinating and important to interrogate in this moment. And there's also obviously so much to unpack from Tara and Melissa's presentations. And so here's also a reminder, folks, you can drop those questions in the Q&A chat. Tara, Melissa, and Helena, thank you again just so much for sharing your work with us. We're going to transition now to a discussion period moderated by Shanna. And so we've got some questions that we've come up with to ask you all. And so again, just use that kind of raise hand function if you want to answer.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. So yeah, this has been absolutely wonderful beyond anything we could imagine. There's so much to talk about in terms of the overlaps, and I look forward to this portion of the discussion, which will be a moderated conversation between us. I want to start with something that came up at the beginning of Dr. Connolly's talk, where she outlined some of the texts that inform her work as texts that she likes to get lost in. And I think this is really important as a kind of key framework, because it recognizes that knowledge is first and foremost relational. So that really resonated with me, because that's always been my journey with who I connect with to produce my own sets of knowledge. And so I think in my ability to work with each of your pieces in the book over the course of the past couple of years, I would feel that your texts are texts that I get to like to get lost with and sit with. And one of the reasons why I would say that and why we brought you together today is because you offer terms and concepts and modes of analysis that help us to grapple with digital culture and activism. And it's not like it's an emerging or new field, but we need frameworks, we need concepts, and it's so nice to have them and to see them together. And for me, what's really important, and this is because in my dissertation, I did a lot of work on feminist media activism in the 60s. So that history is always in my mind. And for me, what you're doing in these pieces is mapping histories and practices from the last 10 years and into the present. And I'm often kept up at night worrying about the way that these practices are going to be overlooked and overwritten by dominant media, by dominant discourse, the way that we have this impoverished sense of what was happening in decades prior and how we've lost some really important things. It really bothers me. But what your chapters are doing is giving us this sort of orientation, this grounding, in order to know about certain practices that have been happening. So I'm really thankful for that. And I think you've shown that today in what you've offered us. And so I kind of wanted to start the moderated portion of the conversation by thinking about the future and where we need to go or attend to next. And maybe what do we draw on from the past to help us get there? So that's just kind of like how I want to shape this. But maybe a more specific question that I'm offering to anybody to take up is, how do you understand the relationship between activism, feminism, and digital culture within the shifting terrain of this current moment where everything feels in flux? And how do you see that playing out for you in your research right now in real time?
Yeah, well, I'll start, and I want to kind of circle back on what you're saying too. The putting together this conceptual framework of #feminism, it took a long time. It took a very long time for me to formulate these understandings, because I was looking for guidance in the digital media studies space and the feminist space about how to think about the digital, and I couldn't find it at the time. And so we all mentioned how, you know, long this volume took for various external reasons, but it also took a long time for me to just write this out and get it out in my brain and on paper. And I think there's a beauty in that too. And I do, the longer I continue to kind of be in this academic space and the scholarly space, the more I really appreciate the slowing down of taking in the readings and the text and the history, as you mentioned. So I just wanted to make that claim as well. But in terms of where I kind of see this, what's happening in the relationship between activism, feminism, and digital culture, I think we're in a moment, and this isn't anything new, where, you know, practices and thought are heavily under scrutiny, right? We've certainly seen this in the past, but I think with this moment we're in with social media and disinformation, and quite frankly, information overload, I think the very idea of critical thought is under threat. We see it in all of kind of these various aspects of our institutions. And so I think, and probably if you ask any kind of public scholar or thinker or advocate or activist, they probably agree that it's a scary moment, but not just for them, but for their communities. It's becoming increasingly difficult to do this kind of change work under the radar. And, you know, for various reasons. But I will say there are a lot of people out there that are doing it and doing it much better than I could. I like to kind of reside in my observer, archivist, documentary space, because I look to the public facing thinkers and activists for how they're making sense of this moment. So I think there's hope there, but I also think that we're kind of in this space where everyone's kind of careful, and for good reason. But I do see us coming out of it. I'm not sure when, but I think there's a way that we can do this kind of work where people and communities aren't harmed. And at least I'm hoping that's the case.
Anybody else want to come in and add to that?
I can add a little bit. I guess just thinking about hope, I'm kind of thinking a lot about the kind of what it means to collaborate in our practices as academics, as well as our practices as activists. And I was recently reading the work of Firouzeh Val, and she writes about solidarity as method. And I think there's something really interesting in that. I can share the link later. But so I think solidarity as method, you know, when I'm thinking with my academic hat, I think a lot about that, you know, how I can have a practice that is not extractivist. And I also think a lot about friendship as method, and the ways in which one can honestly sustain friendship through our work. And so, for example, with the interviews that I did for my chapter, I'm still friends with all of them. You'll see in the chapter that I said I set out to do interviews, but they ended up being conversations. I'm now an absolutely crucial WhatsApp group that I just cannot live without, you know, of other practitioners. So I think, to me, there is hope in thinking about the connections that we're making through our practices of research and activism, and how we can sustain those without kind of a really massive plan. I'm just thinking about how to keep those connections alive. And also another concept I want to bring that I think really helps me as well to think about is the concept of Lorena Catnal, and she's a Guatemalan communitarian feminist. And she writes about this term acuerpando. I'm just going to do it slowly for the interpreters. Acuerpando. So it's kind of like embody but it also means to turn up as a body. And she talks about how acurrucarse is the action of bodies outraged in the face of violence and injustice who come together, and how there is an energy that can be created in that acuerpamiento. So I think the key is to continue to be on the streets, while of course recognizing that not all bodies can equally be on the street with equal amounts of safety. But how can we maintain these practices online and offline? How can we maintain these bodily presences in the spaces, in the public spaces that require us to remain visible while remaining safe? These are the things that I think we could think about.
I'm seeing a really good conversation that I think we can pursue about solidarity as method that I think overlaps in the two conversations. But I want to give Dr. Brown a chance to see if you want to add anything to
that. So I think for my own work, I have both concerns and I think hopes, I guess I would say. So the main concern goes back to that framework I talked about with the co-optation, appropriation, erasure, and thinking about the ways new technologies such as TikTok kind of amplify or speed up the process of those types of pitfalls of digital technology for marginalized people. So I think particularly in the aspect of digital culture, thinking about the ways that, say, Black LGBTQ slang has been taken up by TikTok users who divorce it from its context and then reappropriate it for their own means. The same process has happened for dances, songs. So like Black cultural, I guess, practices being kind of like cannibalized through the features of various digital technologies and digital technology users consuming those kind of, I guess, I don't want to go too far in the metaphor, but these bites of Blackness and what that means. So I think that's my concern for the future. As far as I think my hopes, though, kind of going back to what Dr. Collins said about public intellectual activism, I'm really hopeful that the ways that these digital technology users kind of construct knowledge on these platforms can kind of be a balance to these processes. So in the very same spaces that these appropriations are happening, if once again, using that TikTok metaphor, people are using these features to kind of correct it. So thinking about when I saw a song that was produced, a hip hop song that was produced like in 2010, reemerged as a remix by a white DJ in 2022, very popular on the TikTok app, and a Black digital user coming on to the app and saying, hey, just so you are aware, this is the historical context of this particular song, and this is why it's problematic that when you search through the hashtag associated with this song, you only see white faces, and that the Black women musicians who created this song, as well as the Black male producer of the song, are erased in the context of TikTok. So I think that's one of my hopes too, is the ways that Black digital users kind of function as public intellectuals, bringing histories, bringing sociology, bringing feminism to the conversation, and being able to disrupt these processes of appropriation and erasure.
I feel like this brings up something that comes up at the end of Dr. Connolly's chapter around this idea of reconceptualizing solidarity and addressing feminist entanglements. And perhaps that is something that we're speaking toward right now as something that needs to continue to be at the forefront of what we're doing, especially when we think about, you know, if we're kind of thinking about how critical thought is under threat and disinformation, like the way in which the alt-right is so good at operationalizing media platforms, like all of these things are these absolute threats. And so the question then becomes, how do we make sense of this from a feminist perspective? And when I'm hearing this kind of notion of solidarity, but solidarity how? Solidarity in, like, that's something that I would love to hear your thoughts on, because I think we're all really kind of oriented and committed towards that set of constellations. So that was just a gesture towards a conversation, if you want to jump in.
And this is just kind of off the top of my head. I'm thinking about just solidarity as a very local kind of phenomenon for me in my practice. I practice solidarity as a teacher. It's a pedagogical kind of tenet for me, right? I go in the classroom in these kind of small moments, I guess, I practice solidarity with my communities. I realized very early on, especially going through this process of creating #feminism and writing about it and theorizing about it, not everybody wants to be in solidarity with me, and not everybody wants to be in solidarity with each other. So, you know, I mean, I'm 40 now, about to be 41. There's things that you just kind of realize when you get older. I pick my battles very wisely. But I say that to say that there are these local spaces and these small moments where we can find solidarity with our students, with our families, with our communities, with our local leaders, with our friends. I think that's a beautiful thing, and I don't want to get away from the small and the mundane when it comes to finding solidarity, and then in practicing it as a method of change.
Yeah, that's exactly, I agree with exactly that. You know, it's you know, I don't think solidarity should be a kind of blanket grand gesture, because then it kind of moves very quickly, especially for people like me, into white savior crap, frankly. So it's more about the small moments of awareness and just asking, you know, like we're trying to kind of work really sensitively in the collaboration that I'm doing with Catherine and Silvana to kind of the needs of people that are working with us, and to see them as collaborators rather than subjects. You know, it's just very simple. I don't think it's very big, and so I don't think I said anything that dramatic. I think solidarity is quite small, and when we go too big, then it goes a bit pear-shaped. But I like what Tara was saying about it's kind of these small quotidian gestures that you can practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say for me, I think the solidarity is kind of the guiding one of the guiding tenets of Black feminism, of course, then one of the guiding tenets of my own work. And thinking about the construction of my chapter in particular, the reason why I framed it around Black women and LGBTQ people was because I noticed that in digital space, these two subgroups within Blackness were performing solidarity with one another. So particularly in critiquing heteronormativity, heterosexism, gender, and things like that. So kind of even just one acknowledging that the solidarity is being practiced in real time, and then letting the project be an act of solidarity to honor what's going on. And so I guess thinking about kind of what Dr. Suárez just said, or well, I'm sorry, just said was basically this idea of your collaborators are people that you can kind of learn from solidarity wise, and kind of like letting their practices speak to how you do your work. So getting at what Dr. Colony said too about letting it be a method.
It makes me think a lot about something that Bree and I talk about a lot with our work. We have an Instagram account called aesthetic.resistance, where we try and amplify sort of media work being done within feminist contexts. And we often think, and this is kind of drawing on what you were saying, Dr. Brown, around like the possibilities and the perils of digital culture. But if we think about solidarity in these local contexts, we can take platforms and create spaces within them. I think feminists and feminist media practitioners have been doing this all along. We've always created spaces that we can go and gather. And I think that, you know, the way we understand it is as a bit of a cultural hack. How do we take these platforms, which we know are fraught on every level, and yet they permeate our lives? And then how do we chip away from that and create these things that then give us meaning and sustenance and the ability to kind of go forward? Okay, I'm loving this idea of solidarity as method. I want to, I'm aware of time. We're kind of coming to the end of the conversation. We came up with just to shake things off before we get to the Q&A, we had a very fun set of questions. This is a lightning round, so don't think too hard about this, okay? We just want to know what your favorite digital popular cultural phenomenon or what brings you joy right now? We need joy. So what brings you joy? Just throw something fun up there, or don't say there is none, and that's okay too. But yeah, lightning round. Anybody who has something, please you can start.
I'll give you
Do
something.
you want me to start? Would that be fair if I started? Because I put you on the spot.
I can start, but you can
Please,
start.
good. Okay, go ahead.
I'll just mention something ridiculous, but I guess it does have to do with solidarity in a way. But during the first lockdown in London, where I was at the time, well, before that, I used to go to a pub quiz, and I don't know if you have those in the States. We certainly don't have those in Uruguay, so I have to explain it to people, you know, pub quiz. And then lockdown happened, and nobody could do pub quiz anymore. So some guy started a pub quiz for his mates, and suddenly like 1 million people turned up on his YouTube channel. And he just kept going it, and he's still doing it. So he's been doing this online pub quiz for like 2 years non-stop. And I don't know, and he used to be a homeless person, and he describes that himself. So it's just like really interesting phenomena that happens in lockdown. And I think there was, you know, at the first lockdown in the UK, this sense of solidarity really kind of felt very close to the surface, and we shouldn't lose that. It's kind of there. So that's my favorite digital thing, the pub quiz, and I can send you the link if you want.
I would say my current favorite digital thing is TikTok. I downloaded it during the pandemic because what I noticed was that pretty much all other platforms have become TikTok. So I'd be on Twitter, someone's posting a TikTok. I'd be on Instagram, people are posting TikTok. So I was just like, let me just go to TikTok. And what I really like about TikTok is just the innovation of the creators there, particularly the ones who kind of, I guess, engage in some type of fiction, whether they're doing comedic behavior, and being able to see like young Black people in particular across the diaspora kind of forefront themselves. So for example, my parents are Jamaican, so watching Jamaican TikTok users like create these skits and stuff that remind me of my family and stuff, I think is really cool.
I'll say just conceptually, of course, the counter narrative online remains my favorite thing in the archive. So going back to what I worked with some young people on this project called Ruby, creating a digital toolkit for Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth to bring racial justice education in the schools. And I have had the opportunity to talk with some amazing young people, undergraduates, high school students, who are using Instagram and TikTok to share knowledge about stuff they don't learn about in school when it comes to Black history. So they give me hope. They give me so much hope. I learned so much from them. And there's also, I wanted to send, I saw this kind of retweeted the other day, Black Film Archive on Twitter just retweeted Zora Neale Hurston's ethnographic fieldwork footage from 1928. I thought that was amazing. I'd never seen it before. Folks are doing that beautiful archival and counter narrative work online. And then just kind of in the Hollywood space, I'm really excited about some of the stories that are coming out on streaming. I've been watching Station 11, Archive 81, Southside, Yellow Jackets, characters of color, minoritized characters, girls are leading in these roles, and it's beautiful to see. It's something that I think Hollywood has been listening to the Oscar so white hashtags and people kind of talking back to these institutions, and I'm glad to see that reflected in Hollywood.
I'm going to just add to that. So I love young adult fantasy fiction and fan art, which is my digital pop culture space of joy. And I got to come across a book that I'm currently reading that I'm obsessed with called Legendborn by Tracy Dion. And it's so important as a book in that genre, but I think more broadly because it really takes that coming of age witch narrative and maps it onto reckoning with colonialism and slavery and the effects of colonization. And it's just amazing. So I'm going to put that as my thing that's giving me joy, that's going to add to what you were talking about, Dr. Connelly. Thank you. And so I think in the last couple of minutes, I think we have, I believe, 2 questions. I have to open a couple of windows here. So apologies as I try and look at my multiple screens. I had 3 questions, I think. Nope, 2. Okay, so I'm going to just put forward these 2 questions, and then I'm going to leave it over to Bree to close out the session. The first question is specifically for Helena, or Dr. Suárez Val, and it asks, can you please expand a bit more on the being surrounded by femicide concept? Because the question is, the person asking the question says that it's absolutely fascinating. They want to hear more about it.
Yes, although I'm not a doctor yet. I'm hoping I will submit this year, but I'm working on it. Thank you. So this being surrounded by feminicide, it relates to the sensitivity to geographical space, you know, but it also relates to something else, which is how the definition of feminicide. Not everybody agrees on this, but you know, feminicide is considered by some feminist scholars to be the tip of the iceberg. The final lethal end in a continuum of violence. And there's some disagreements about whether speaking about a continuum is helpful because it's, you know, it implies a simplicity that is not so linear and so on. But if you can think about that, some activists not only talk about feminicide, but they talk about feminicidal violence. And feminicidal violence is everything that will somehow end up in the potential for a woman to, no, in the potential for a man to kill a woman, because essentially that is the way it happens. So this idea of being surrounded by feminicide is a potential, you know, it's a potential approach to how we understand gender-related violence and how it's a so-called microaggressions or microsexisms, which are not so micro in the lived experience of daily being a woman. You know, how those surround us and it's pervasive. So that's, you know, this conceptual thing about being surrounded by feminicidal violence. There's a geographical space as well, and there's something about embodied experience of doing the map that I'll share, because I think it's also about thinking how these practices work, you know, in terms of becoming an archive. Is that I am an archive of these cases as well. So it's not just a spreadsheet and it's not just a map, it's also my own embodied memory and lived experience. And so my slightly sad anecdote is that a few months ago, I was going to a part of Uruguay that I don't usually go to. And I suddenly realized I was recognizing some of the name places. And I was like, I've never been here, why am I recognizing these? And then I realized they were all locations that were on the map. So I was kind of, you know, just traversing the land through my knowledge of cases of feminicide that happened over the last 5-6 years I've been doing the work. So that's what that relates to. If you're interested in thinking a bit more about the map, I did write an article called Vibrant Maps, Thinking Through New Materialism. So I can share the link to that. And there I speak a little bit about the vibrancy of mapping itself as a thing. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's a way to share that in the chat, that would be awesome, even just a link to it. Thank you. I think this last question is actually a really great way to end things, because I think one thing we've been gesturing towards, thinking about method, thinking about where to go next, is a question of data and the way in which as feminists, we need to really think about data, especially with I mean, at Feminist Think Tank, we think about this a lot because we like to rely on small data curation and the importance of embodied collecting of data and how that really flies in the face of the prominence of big data right now and then the requirement for it. And so I think this is a great kind of closing question. And it says, what are the challenges of working with these type of data that you're using? I can imagine it's difficult for the content availability and position, but also because of the emotions involved. And I think that speaks to a lot of the overarching themes here of how we relate in our embodied ways. But then so I open that to you. What are the challenges of working with the data that you do? And are there specific challenges? Are they affective? Are they conceptual, intellectual? Is there gatekeeping you're experiencing? I'd love to hear from you on that.
So I think for me, the challenges, you did mention gatekeeping, and I do think that's one key challenge. I don't know if Dr. Colony has the same experience, but when you are trying to do Black feminist thought, especially in fields that don't typically bring Black feminist thought to the forefront, such as digital media studies, there's a lot of questioning about, is Black feminist thought even theory, in the sense that can it be operationalized for empirical purposes? So I think like that's the key gatekeeping of people questioning whether or not Black feminist thought can even be a framework for digital studies. I think for the affective experience of kind of being in these digital spaces, especially if we're studying gender-based violence or state violence, I do think it can be effective in the sense that, like, for me, and I think I'm going to call you Dr. Val, is that talking about the ways that we are embodying our experiences. So for me, like studying police violence and then actually being subject to police violence in my own experience and having members of my family being subject to police violence, I think can be very difficult to kind of figure out how to situate yourself as an intellectual, but also as a victim of these institutional processes, and like how you can, or how, especially, I guess another form of gatekeeping in the academy is the way you can even talk about these experiences, right? Like we as feminist scholars say we study lived experiences, but based on whatever type of disciplinary heritage that we're coming from, there's a way that we're supposed to articulate it that still kind of, I think, divorces it from its humanity, right? So thinking about writers like Tressie Cottom, for example, who kind of bring a more, I would say, human lens on their writing from sociological perspectives or disciplinary perspectives, I think is the key challenge. As far as the data that itself, I think it, once again, the challenge is maybe disciplinary in the sense that coming from sociology, much of the way that they engage digital data is through that big data machine learning approach. So if that's the approach that I'm taking when I do quantitative studies, people love it. They eat it up. But when I decide that I want to take a more ethnographic approach and like a more feminist approach of kind of looking at myself as navigating the cyberspaces that Black women and LGBTQ people are constructing, and I guess a more ethnographic qualitative lens, I think there's more pushback around what does it mean to be ethnographer in cyberspace, and what are the ethics around that? What is the proper approach? So I think, unfortunately, because we're forging new approaches to these fields, there's a lot of questions about methods and theory that I don't necessarily think that we would get if we were using established approaches or established types of data.
Yeah, that absolutely co-sign on all of that. Yes. So I'm going back to the days when I was putting together and creating and coding the hashtag Feminism website. It was certainly embodied, an embodied practice. Crouching over the computer and making these things, but it was also what it was also a way that I had to think. My sort of epistemological way of approaching this kind of work is through making. I have to make something, whether it be through code and then the visual. It helps me kind of get through it. But there certainly was some moments when, we come across tweets or images, particularly when Ferguson was happening, where it was just, we were all trying to figure out how do we even write about this stuff. There's an article at hashtag ethnography and talks about the sort of ethics of care that researchers have to take when even doing studies on social movements through tweets. Like, when do we decide to use them, write about them, include them? These are all questions that I also grapple with. A recent chapter in Uncertain Archives, I write about hashtag archiving and kind of give a researchers and scholars a way to think through how to document this stuff and repurposing data across these digital spaces. I'm tending to go back now and mentioning Professor Brock and his work on Twitter and reminding us of the joy that comes with doing this work. Him and I kind of bump heads sometimes because I say it's not always joy. Twitter is not always joy, but I see where you're coming from. But now I kind of get a sense what he's saying, right? And I'm actually also reading McKittrick's book here, Dear Science, where she also talks about Blackness as methodology and the joy that we get in doing this kind of practice work. So I kind of feel myself moving from skeptical doomsday dystopian to, okay, let me listen to what these Black scholars and my friends are talking about, because I think we do have to find joy, especially when we're going through the data that we go through on a daily basis sometimes. So I'm learning and I'm working on it. I'm trying to be more optimistic about the worlds in which I study and document and archive, but I'm hopeful still.
Any last thoughts? It's a great question, and I think it could lead us into a whole other speaker series. I feel like we could do a whole other book on method, and in particular methods of feminist solidarity and what that looks like in all these different ways, because we're coming from different disciplinary spaces, right? I look forward to a continued conversation. If not, I'm going to actually pass this over to Bree to close us out. And I just want to be cognizant. Thank you for bringing everything to the table right now to this conversation. I know it's an exhausting moment, and it's been an absolute joy and honor to speak to you all.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you, so much to our speakers for your insights. Thank you for sharing your experiences. And also thank you to you, our audience, for your questions and really for your eagerness to be here with us today. Knowing that you're all here having these conversations with us makes us feel much more collaborative and communicative. To conclude today's session, I want to reflect just for a moment on the ethos of this speaker series, especially coming out of that last question on joy and data and the tough, deep, angry spaces of the internet that we find ourselves in. And I think that we can feel that the spirit of this talk was really centered around collaborative knowledge sharing and community building. And I think that particularly within this moment of collective exhaustion and widespread injustice, one way that we can push back at the often competitive and individualist impulses upheld by the academy is to try to create these spaces of collaborative relational knowledge sharing. And even if it is just for an hour or two, I think that this can give us the kinds of support and maybe connections needed to keep pushing, to keep questioning, and to also keep celebrating and highlighting all of that which resists and also brings joy. So thank you again, everybody. We hope that you enjoyed your time here with us, and we really look forward to seeing you on February 16th at our next event with the next 3 speakers from our book. And that one will be on networked identities and communities. So thank you again to everybody here. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our ASL interpreters. We'll close it out and we will see you all next time.
Thank you.